When I started work all those years ago, women doing the same thing got paid less than men. It seemed ridiculous to me, and also to all the men I asked about it, except for one who gave a nasty little smirk, but refused to say why men should get paid more. The issue was getting big. Politicians were planning to bring in equal pay legislation. There was a noisy opposition to it, mainly from employers' organisations and the politicians they had in their pockets. They gave out the usual kinds of scare stories powerful people give out whenever policies are proposed to make life fairer or freer. Men would lose their jobs to women, the economy would crash under cheaper competition, and even women's traditional jobs would be lost to men attracted by fairer pay. None of this happened, of course. The economy to this day is still booming, thanks in part to North Sea oil. Most corporate lawyers, drug lords, and ditch diggers are still male, and how many school dinner ladies are men? At this stage, I was well disposed towards feminism, or women's lib as it was often called, but after equal pay, there were a number of things that changed all that. First was the persecution of Erin Pizzey by feminists. This remarkable woman had started the whole domestic violence refuge process, which had helped so many women and children escape from violent partners, mainly men. However, she refused to conceal the fact that women could also be violent in relationships, and this led to her being vilified and bullied, receiving many death and bomb threats. It was appalling that this woman who had done so much to help so many was being treated with such cruelty by loads of female activists. It wasn't just Erin Pizzey they were gunning for. Anyone uncovering any evidence of female violence was victimised. Researchers questioning men in outpatient accident and emergency units, even the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, were demonised, bullied and harassed. The next nail in the coffin of my support for feminism came with the emergence into the mainstream media of the dogma that all violence came from men and that any violence committed by women was because they had been forced into it by cruel, domineering men. Many women, including highly educated types, began to see the child torturer and murderer Myra Hindley as a feminist martyr, a poor little victim of her cruel, violent partner, Ian Brady. To most realistic people, Hindley and Brady were both highly deranged, manipulative people who brought out the worst in each other, with Brady specialising in thinking up the crimes and Hindley making sure they got carried out. But that's not how most feminists saw it. It wasn't until the much publicised case of a jilted lesbian knife-whipping her ex that many mainstream women were forced with undisguised reluctance to admit that women could be violent without being made to do it by domineering men. I can only wonder how much damage was done to the child victims of violent or sexually abusive mothers by the insistence of the professionals responsible for helping them that their fathers were entirely to blame. The third issue to alienate me from feminism was rape. Until near the end of the 20th century, the rape of men and boys was not recognised in law. When politicians planned to change this, a lot of feminists disagreed, saying that only females should be regarded as rape victims. As far as I could make out, their best argument for this was that only women could be made pregnant by rape. But what about little girls or old women? I saw this refusal to understand that males could be raped as a kind of victim blaming, with being female as part of the responsibility for the rape. To me, the rapist is entirely responsible for the rape, and whether the victim is male or female, the mentality of the rapist is the same. Experts tell us that rape is all about power and domination, and, with the exception of entirely unconscious victims, is also about causing great suffering. To be fair, though, there were feminists who were okay about this change in the law. Fourthly, and lastly, was a murder conviction. The convict was a woman who'd snapped after many years of suffering every possible kind of abuse by her cruel and domineering husband. She killed him with a hammer and got a 20 stretch for murder. It was deeply unjust. Feminists came up with the idea that it was an exclusively female response to suffering this kind of relentless abuse that made them suddenly commit an act of great violence without being able to control it, a kind of temporary insanity. While this idea may have helped this unfortunate woman with her appeals, it's obvious that this kind of coil spring behaviour can also occur in good-natured men and boys who are subject to years of abuse. It's wrong to kill people, but being a victim of persistent cruelty must be a very powerful mitigation. Such people need our help rather than further victimisation by the state, and I think the law has begun to recognise this. Why else would 40-year-old violent defendants be trying to blame it all on something a parent did or didn't do to them when they were aged 6 1/4? However, by this point in time, I was no longer pro-feminist. Although feminists would no doubt disagree, that doesn't mean I've become anti-women. Instead, I look to equality as a human right, and unlike some of the people who reject feminism, I regard women as true human beings entitled to the same rights as men, and not as some kind of subspecies with only limited rights. The only big difference I can find between men and women is in the reproductive organs. Taken as a whole, women are a bit smaller and less strong than men, but there are many men who are smaller and less strong than many women. Plus, women are every bit as intelligent and as stupid as men. So I guess the test of my understanding of the equal rights of women must be to do with the reproductive system. These days, the most controversial issue involving the human reproductive system is abortion. I think it should obviously be a crime to force a woman to have an abortion against her will, or to force her to take a pregnancy to full term against her will. People who commit such crimes against women should be treated the same way as any other person who rapes or forces people into sexual slavery. Men are not banned from having medical procedures on their reproductive bits and pieces, and women should be given that right too. Most of the anti-abortion activism comes from Christians, especially from the worldwide Catholic Church and the many small evangelical Protestant churches found across the world, but concentrated in the south-central and southeastern parts of the USA. They generally believe that embryos are full human beings with rights perhaps greater than those of the women who bear them, because never having lived in the world, they are seen as less sinful. Many Christians believe that their religion means they are entitled, wherever possible, to force others to conform to such beliefs. This entitlement thing is not new when it comes to Christianity. Even in the early days when Christianity was spreading through the Roman empires, you had such things as gangs of monks going around murdering pagan priests and priestesses, and the massacre of unarmed pagan civilians in a crowded hippodrome by fully armed and armoured Christian Roman soldiers. The spread of Christianity through the tribal kingdoms of much of Europe was even worse. Often the superstitious kings were converted by a successful battle which was victorious, they were told, because of the Christian God. In ever-widening circles, the kingdom's inhabitants would be made to choose between converting to Christianity and being put to the sword, or worse. Many lost their lives. Elsewhere, in northeast Europe, the Teutonic Knights, a crusading order, fought brutal, scorched-earth warfare for many decades against pagans. When they ran out of pagans to murder, Christians turned on each other with crusades and inquisitions and factional wars. The Bosnian Crusade, for example, was sparked by a young Bosnian teenage girl refusing the sexual advances of a Catholic priest. European wars between Catholics and Protestants killed 15 million or more, with many, many rapes. The Dominicans ran most of the torture chambers of the Inquisitions, but some were manned by Franciscans. Many thousands died, yet far more were disabled or driven insane by the cruelty that had been inflicted on them. In later centuries came the genocides by Christians of indigenous Americans and Australasians, and later genocides during the mid-20th century in Europe, where the majority of the fighters in the Axis powers were Christian, especially Catholic. Even in Nazi Germany itself, where the ruling class was mystically racist, until the closing months of World War II, the majority of German fighting men were Christians. In Croatia, The largest extermination camp, called Jasenovac, was run by Catholic nationalists. To spare bullets, the main extermination method was knives strapped to hands with which many throats could be slashed without causing hand strain. The other frequent method was to stand lines of victims in a long trench and walk along the line with either an axe or a railway mallet, smashing their skulls in. At least 3 of the mass murderers there were priests, the head warder being a brutal, soft-spoken sadist who was a Franciscan friar with a special fondness for murdering schoolgirls and babies. Such atrocities were carried out for many centuries by deeply Christian people, many of whom sincerely believed this was good work. Lots of the powerful people in Western societies have recently begun to realise that torture and rape and genocide are not good work, even though some of them try it on every now and then. Having a strong belief system is okay, but forcibly imposing it on others, even if you believe yourself to be totally right, is nothing short of cruel and domineering. Yet that is what is happening to many women because of political and other pressure by Christians. A fairly recent television documentary secretly filmed British Christians telling lies to apparently pregnant women about made-up, non-existent illnesses that they claimed happened to women who have abortions. Deliberate lies, motivated presumably by sincere beliefs. Embryos are certainly potential human beings, in the same way that a bud on a branch has potential to become a tree. But the theory that they are actual trees, and that the pruning of a bud is equivalent to chopping down a tree, is surely absurd. Usually, anti-abortion activists speak of embryos as babies, and most think they have consciousness, can feel pain, and so on. There is no evidence for this, but if it was so, then an embryo in a womb must be suffering constant, unbearable agony. There is a form of torture called water torture, known in the USA as waterboarding. The womb is a liquid environment, and so the embryo has to endure 9 months of water torture, combined with extreme bondage, especially towards the end. Not nice, assuming the embryo really is capable of consciously experiencing things. So it seems clear to me that someone who believes that all embryos are full human beings and should never be aborted is someone who consciously or otherwise believes that babies should be tortured.